So for more insight, it's a pleasure to welcome international law expert Natasha Hausdorff, the director at UK Lawyers for Israel, and she's joining us from London. Thank you so much, Natasha, for your time. All eyes on Shifa Hospital in Gaza as the IDF forces work to eliminate the Hamas threat. So let's get some legal clarity here. Talk us through the laws of war, so to speak, when there's a terror command center below a hospital and troops have to navigate their way past civilian sites to get to these terror sites.
Well, let's start, if I may, with the war crime of using a protected building like a hospital, the most protected building in the context of the laws of armed conflict, so much so that even a military hospital is considered to be protected under the laws of war. The war crime that Hamas commits by using institutions like that as command and control centers is the first issue to pick up in terms of the laws of armed conflict. And it's deeply disappointing that we're not hearing greater condemnation or in some quarters any condemnation of these breaches of the laws of armed conflict by Hamas. But certainly in terms of Israel's response, we have seen careful operations around not just Al-Shifa but other hospitals in the Gaza Strip, despite the fact that these are legitimate military targets. That is as a matter of customary international law, but it's also reflected in Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, that when these protected buildings are being used for military purposes after warnings, they become legitimate military targets. That Israel is now going into Al-Shifa with military personnel, along with medical personnel, Arabic speakers, as you've just been reporting, and not targeting the hospitals themselves with airstrikes is testament to the proportionality assessment that the IDF conducts. Even though the hospitals become a legitimate military target, Israel seeks to prevent civilian casualties wherever it can. And its approach and the military strategy that it has adopted with respect to hospitals across Gaza are reflective of its compliance with international law, and in particular with that principle of proportionality.
Over and above that, Natasha, we're seeing these extraordinary images of IDF forces delivering incubators, baby food, medical supplies for Gazan patients. What is your take on the efforts Israel is taking to try to protect Palestinian civilians, and how unprecedented is this during a war?
But it certainly goes over and above the requirements in the laws of armed conflict. The requirement, I should state, under Article 23 of the Fourth Geneva Convention is simply that a law-abiding military facilitate the supply by third parties of humanitarian provisions, subject to the caveat, if that can be done without diversion to the opposing military forces, to the Hamas or other Palestinian terrorist groups in this case. Now, the difficulty from the outset in terms of the provision of humanitarian aid by third parties has been the long documented, evidenced history that Hamas has of diverting those resources to its own terrorist infrastructure and its military efforts. And therefore, the requirement on Israel to facilitate third parties providing materials is obviated, arguably, or at least extremely limited. Having said that, what Israel is now doing, and I see this as particularly coming out of the fact that so much of the provision by third parties is undoubtedly diverted to Hamas purposes. Israel's initiative in providing directly aid to civilians, and indeed, as you've described, incubators, which I, for one, think is unprecedented in the context of the history of armed conflict, is all about the IDF going over and above the provisions of international law and practically seeking to help civilians in this extremely difficult, strategically complex scenario where Hamas quite apart from breaking the rules of international law, is seeking to profit from its breaches of international law and its harm to the civilians in Gaza, and generate as many civilian casualties as it can.
So then talk us through the impact of the media coverage of exactly what you're describing, this highly complex operation. The BBC, you're in London, apologizing for reporting incorrect information. It said medical teams and Arab speakers were being targeted by Israeli forces, as you alluded to earlier, instead of saying, in fact, IDF forces included these medical teams and Arabic speakers for the operation. The BBC did say this error fell below their usual editorial standards, but emotions are high. How damaging are mistakes like this right now?
Well, their usual editorial standards seem to be very low indeed, don't they? We've seen a consistent misrepresentation of international law and of the facts on the ground across their coverage for well over a month. What is utterly extraordinary in the context of their misrepresentation of this Reuters report in the way that you've described is that the only conclusion it can leave us with is that the BBC, as others unfortunately, appear to operate from a position where they attribute an evil intent to Israel, and that leads their reporting. It also appears to lead their decision to accept so much of what Hamas puts out as propaganda, so much so that they have been called a mouthpiece of Hamas. This reflects also their coverage of casualty figures that are put out by the Hamas-controlled health ministry.
Right.
So unfortunately, even though they've apologized for the grotesque misreporting today, they haven't rowed back on so much, to the extent that they are still reporting the casualty figures that Hamas has put out from the Al Ali hospital car park strike without any verification. And unfortunately, that looks likely to continue.
Certainly is staggering, especially coming from the BBC itself. Natasha, the fate of the hostages being held by Hamas inside Gaza is obviously top of mind here. Abducting civilians, babies, women, the elderly from their homes, from a music festival. You mentioned war crimes earlier. How exactly is all of this classified under international law? Not to mention the conditions they are being held under, the lack of information, the filming of hostages, which is obviously part of the psychological warfare. Talk us through the war crimes and the crimes against humanity perpetuated by Hamas on the 7th of October and since then.
I think there are reasonable people and legal and military commentators who have been clear that this is amongst the worst atrocities that we have ever seen. Certainly war crimes, crimes against humanity, in light of the intent that Hamas has been plain, that it continues to seek to replicate the 7th of October atrocities, that it continues to fire missiles onto Israeli civilians. Let's not forget, every single one of those missiles is also a war crime because they are targeting civilians with those strikes. All of that is informed by what they say their intent is, which is to annihilate the Jews and wipe Israel off of the map. And that leaves us with the conclusion that what we witnessed on the 7th of October and subsequently are also crimes of genocide. In that respect, there is a responsibility on the international community, on all states parties, to the Convention for the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, to act not just on Israel, a legal obligation to respond appropriately, but also, I would argue, on the international community at large. The fact that Hamas have documented their atrocities, have celebrated their atrocities,
boasted about their atrocities,
and videoed them, of course, and put these appalling images out on social media, that is all undeniable evidence of the crimes that have been committed, and the moral equivalence that we have seen in terms of the commentary around Hamas blatant war crimes and what is being alleged against Israel is deeply, deeply troubling. And it seeks to warp the situation that Israel finds itself in and makes it very hard indeed for the general public around the world to properly appreciate and understand the position that Israel finds itself in as the bulwark against this radical Islamist extremism, terror that seeks to annihilate, let's face it, the West. It's not just Israel.
And as you say, even though Hamas filmed these brutal attacks on the 7th of October, there are still many questioning what actually happened when they themselves wanted to film it and make it go viral as it has. We need to leave it there, but we so appreciate your insight. International law expert Natasha Hausdorff, live from London. Thank you so much for being with us on I24 News. We will be watching to see how things unfold.